In 2009, US President Barack Obama announced that imports of Chinese tires used on cars and light trucks would have to pay a tariff equal to 35% of the tire's value. The purpose was to save jobs. But at the time the tariff went into effect, owners of US firms that sell Chinese tires claimed the tariff would cause them losses. Other business people worried that the Chinese government would retaliate by raising tariffs on US goods, and consumer groups protested that the tariff raised prices they paid for tires. The tariff was enacted for 3 years, after which the tariff was allowed to expire. By 2013, imports of Chinese tires were rising to their pre-tariff levels. In this video, we will explore this challenge in the context of decision-making tools we can use to make economically efficient decisions while realizing the full impact of trade barriers on our economy.
A few thoughts now on our relationship with China in the face of North Korean provocations. President Trump has reversed himself on the issue of labeling China a currency manipulator for a number of reasons. Two of them. One, the yuan, their currency, rising against the dollar. That's a good thing, not a bad thing for our exports to China, even though it's not much help for imports from China, which become more expensive. But in the midst of all of this, President Trump offering China better terms on trade, saying he told Xi Jinping, solve the problem in North Korea, that's worth having deficits. China, right now, our third largest export market, civilian aircraft, soybeans and cars are top exports. China, the number one source of imports to America, cell phones, computers, and telecommunications equipment, topping our list of imports. All of that resulting in a trade deficit last year of almost $350 billion. So effectively, President Trump is saying we'll buy a solution with North Korea, whether spending on missiles or munitions or continuing with a massive trade deficit with China. He'll take the latter. The president is not the first to make such a bargain. He is the first president, however, to be so clear and unvarnished in his acknowledgement of exactly what he's doing. The good news is Xi Jinping has signed up with the president to find a peaceful solution.
The increase in international trade over the past 50 years is the result of falling shipping costs, the spread of cheap and reliable communications, and changes in government policies. During this period, trade tariffs have fallen. A tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imports. Imports are goods and services bought domestically but produced in other countries. Exports are goods and services produced domestically but sold in other countries. As a student of this macroeconomics class, I want you to have an appreciation for the realities of trade barriers in our country and around the world. This is part of the challenge, to think like an economist. Fundamentally, recognize that all trade is affected by companies that make a product to sell domestically or internationally. Buyers are either people or companies wanting to use that product. Sometimes, governments are the buyers of the goods made, but consumers are the nexus of the world's open market economies. When we hear of tariffs designed to protect American workers, our values are strummed to fill a cord of responsibility as we penalize the products of other countries that are thought to have an unfair advantage over American workers and companies. As we talk of tariffs and certain other trade barriers, we introduce a potentially hot topic. There are several misconceptions about tariffs that many people are unaware of. The leading misconception starts by asking, who pays for a tariff? When a good is made then shipped out of a foreign country, bound for a U.S. port of entry, it can face a duty fee before it is allowed to enter the importing country. The duty is payable at entry, collected from the U.S. import agent, and immediately paid to the U.S. government. Tariff fees are neither paid by the exporting country, nor are the fees sent to affected U.S. industry workers. Tariffs are used by the U.S. government for often undisclosed purposes. As those goods are shipped to retail outlets, they are sold to U.S. buyers, who pay the full cost of the tariff fees as part of the goods' retail price. Pay close attention to this detail. Domestic consumers pay the full cost of the tariff placed on the foreign-made goods we purchase in our domestic stores. Start with this reality. Trade barriers are domestic rules established to limit the free trade of goods and services within our country by making foreign-sourced goods more expensive than a domestic good. This does not happen by making domestic products less expensive. It makes the foreign-sourced good more expensive to those who would buy it. Because of factors of supply and demand and market competition, this often results in the increased prices for domestic goods to the level of the foreign-sourced goods. Second, all trade barriers are self-imposed taxes on U.S. consumers who would purchase foreign-made products that are less expensive in a competitive market. In our situation, tariffs are taxes placed on goods entering the U.S. market and incorporated into the cost of the good. They are not taxes placed on the foreign country or offshore company. They are taxes paid by U.S. consumers. Finally, tariffs are an international trade game of favoritism, where U.S. consumers are taxed for their consumption of foreign-made goods in an effort to benefit domestic workers involved in industries competing against foreign companies who make goods and services. As you will see in this video, the realities of this mirage can surprise and frustrate consumers who have supported the sense of the intent without realizing the realities of the situation. Look for positive evidence to make your own conclusions. Since 1970, both exports and imports have steadily increased as a fraction of U.S. gross domestic product, our GDP. Some sectors of the economy, such as the service sector, are not greatly affected by international trade, but the United States exports about 50% of its wheat and rice crops, and 20% of its corn crops. About 20% of U.S. manufacturing jobs depend directly or indirectly on exports. Many people accept the status of China as the world's largest exporter, shipping goods widely on a price competition basis. What is a lesser-known statistic is the status of the United States as the world's second largest exporter, only slightly behind China. In the U.S., we purchase foreign-made goods while we ship our products around the world in the globalization of our consumption trends. The United States is the world's second largest exporter, but international trade is less important to the United States than it is to most other countries because of the size of our economy. Other developed nations rely on international trade to buy and sell goods as a fundamental part of their market. Take, for instance, Belgium and the Netherlands, nearest neighbors, each relying on international trade to support their successful economic foundations. As you can see, America's status on this graph shows how the USA is anchored in domestically produced and consumed goods, with less than 25% of all products sourced from or destined for global markets. At the beginning of this video, Goodyear tires were introduced as an intended benefactor of the tire tariff against Chinese tire producers. As we look under the hood, we realize that Chinese tires were targeted at low-end markets that the U.S. companies like Goodyear had departed long before the tariff was implemented. In addition, Goodyear had previously offshored some of its production to China for similar cost competition reasons. As a result of the tariff, one Goodyear strategy was to shift production to other Asian producers and away from China. The tire tariff expired, and Chinese-made tires returned to U.S. markets without the tax burden to be borne by U.S. consumers.
Take a look right now at top companies who import and also who export a lot of goods and how they're faring, because they are some of the only names that are not seeing green here. We have retailer suppliers like Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Sears, Dollar General, mostly are down, but as President Trump rips up TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and wants to change the foundation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, what does the future hold for these all-American companies who depend on moving goods across borders. Let me bring in now, earlier, Peter, I called you the Donald Trump trade czar, and you said in the commercial break, Liz, be careful, you know what happens to czars. So let me just call you Trump's Director of Trade.
With their hands, please.
Not yet. It's too early in
Down
the administration.
To the square and tar and feathers.
Peter Navarro, of course, Trade and Industrial Policy Director for Donald Trump. On a very big market day, Peter, you have to explain to me what we say to companies that our viewers own, and that is the Targets and the Walmarts, and then, of course, the international papers that are among the biggest exporters and importers, that they should not fear what Donald Trump wants to do with trade.
Let's go back to the day after the election. Everybody that morning, the futures were spiking negative. It's crazy. Everybody's running around with their hair on fire. It's just nuts. And the argument that day was simple. Look, calm down. Donald Trump is going to do four things. He's going to cut taxes, particularly the corporate tax. He's going to reduce regulation. He's going to unleash our energy sector. And he's going to make smart, tough trade deals that increase our growth, decrease our trade deficit, and strengthen our manufacturing base. And what did we see? We saw the market go up on a trajectory now where, what a great day, we hit 20,000 on the Dow. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of concern about what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, we got out of TPP. What an historic day that was on Monday. One stroke of the pen, and it destroyed the worst trade deal we ever would have had, particularly for our auto industry in Michigan. And what happened? Asia rallied. The people understand that what's good for America, what's good for trade, is good for the markets, what's good for the economy.
Okay, now we get paid to look for things like black swans, gray swans. Donald Trump has been a white swan when it comes to really juicing these markets. You cannot deny it.
He won't like that, by the way. Being called a white swan, I can assure you President Trump will go, that's good.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that the traders told me when I came here on the floor, they said this is about 75% Donald Trump. We're at 20,072. But you wrote the book, Death by China. Let me look for one of those potential black swans here. Today we got some news out of China, and I have to ask you, in a rare move, China announced major saber rattling. They said that they're going to deploy this new East Wind, this Dongfeng nuclear missile. It carries 12 nuclear warheads. You do have some people wondering, are we inching towards some horrific nuclear face-off against China because of Donald Trump's very strong words against China and the unbalanced deal they always seem to get out of these trade deals?
Well, on the military side, this is nothing new. This announcement today is something that's been going on for the last decade. Liz, you mentioned my Death by China book, but the recent book I did called Crouching Tiger talks about how China has benefited from taking our jobs, basically earning a bunch of money off the American worker and consumer, and now what they're doing is they're building very sophisticated weapons. And it's been years, over the last years during the Obama administration, where China has been expanding in the South China Sea, expanding in the East China Sea. So today is nothing new. Today's got nothing to do with Donald Trump. This is China being China. Our posture is simple here, Liz. We respect China's sovereignty. It's a sovereign nation. If it wants to do things like that, it has the right to do that. But America also has the right to defend its markets against unfair competition, to defend its manufacturing base against unfair taxation like the WTO imposes on us. And Mr. Trump has made it clear, President Trump has made it clear, that we are going to move forward with trade policies that benefit America. And it's going to be great for this country and great for the world.
People trade in markets because it makes them better off, whether the buyer and seller live in the same city or in different countries. Comparative advantage is the ability of an individual, a firm, or a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than competitors. Opportunity cost is the highest valued alternative that must be given up to engage in an activity. Comparative advantage explains why people pursue different occupations and why countries produce different goods and services. Countries are better off if they specialize in producing the goods for which they have a comparative advantage and trade for the goods for which other countries have a comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is the ability to produce more of a good or service than competitors when using the same amount of resources. We often use the textbook example of 2 countries and 2 products to make the point of trade. In reality, these concepts play out to show how opportunity costs drive the international trade mechanism, even when one country can produce all goods cheaper than other countries. Autarky is a situation in which a country does not trade with other countries. There are few actual examples in the world of today, but examples are found with countries like North Korea and even Brazil. The terms of trade is the ratio at which a country can trade its exports for imports from other countries. This is a critical component of international trade. In order to sell products to other countries, the subject nation must purchase goods and services from the other nation. There has to be a trade between the countries. Although countries as a whole are better off trading, trade can harm firms and workers in industries that produce goods for which they have a comparative disadvantage, realized through a higher opportunity cost. International trade allows production of a good to shift to the more efficient country, the one with the comparative advantage in producing the good. Countries gain from specializing in producing goods in which they have a comparative advantage and trading for goods in which other countries have the comparative advantage. The terms of trade refers to the relative price of exports in terms of imports and is defined as the ratio of export prices to import prices. It can be interpreted as the amount of import goods an economy can purchase per unit of export goods. This can be defined at the level of individual goods and services, or generally at a sector or country level. In this case, trade between Japan and the USA can be expressed as a trade-off between cell phone and tablet computers. Keep in mind, trade must be enacted to bolster the economic conditions of both countries. We see how Japan producers are more efficient, or have a lower opportunity cost, to produce both cell phones and tablet computers than the US producers make. By focusing on comparative advantage between the producers in each country, how Japan concentrates production on cell phones while the US focuses on tablet computers. When this happens, total production of goods is increased. Consumption with trade is increased in each country by 1,500 units in each market. These are the benefits created by open trade, even though one participant was less efficient in the production of both products. Generally, we don't see complete specialization in the real world for 3 reasons. Not all goods and services are traded internationally. Production of goods involves increasing opportunity costs, and tastes for products differ based on the country using them. Cultural differences are a significant factor. Dairy products produced for consumption in the USA may not be culturally acceptable for consumption in Finland. An automobile produced for drivers in Britain may need a significant redesign for sale in India. When trade takes place between 2 countries, both countries benefit because each experiences an increase in total consumption. But countries do not produce goods. Firms do. Firms that do not produce a good for which they have a comparative advantage can lose revenue, and their workers can lose their jobs as a result of international trade. Quotas are implemented by governments, usually at the urging of domestic producers to protect jobs of domestic workers. The quota limits the amount of foreign-made goods delivered to the home country. Comparative advantage comes from several factors. Among the main sources are climate and natural resources, also called national endowments, relative abundance of labor and capital, technology, and external economies. External economies are reductions in a firm's costs that result from an increase in the size of the industry. While these factors may seem to favor certain countries specifically, they build on trends and international growth through time. It may be as simple as traditions, making certain commodities that are passed through generations and sold in markets. Consider pickup trucks made in the USA to specifically fit American farming and forestry needs. 100 years ago, the Erie Canal made an unique combination of trade and services for upstate New York and Manhattan. It happened much by events arranged in time to create this nexus of activity. This activity happened in this location and through events unfolding because of that situation to make Manhattan the hub of financial activities. External economies of scale increase the productivity of an entire industry, geographical area, or economy. The external factors are outside the control of a particular country and encompass positive externalities that reduce the firm's costs within that sector. A country may develop a comparative advantage in the production of a good and later lose its comparative advantage in that good and develop a comparative advantage in producing other goods. This describes the experience of the production of consumer electronics in the United States. For several decades, the United States had a comparative advantage in the production of consumer electronics. Gradually, other countries gained access to similar technology and resources, and the United States lost its comparative advantage. By the mid-2000s, as the technology underlying consumer electronics evolved, comparative advantage had shifted again, and several U.S. firms surged ahead of their competitors, especially those located in Japan. Once a country loses its comparative advantage in producing a good, its income will be higher and its economy more efficient if it switches from producing the good to importing it, as the United States did when it switched from producing televisions to importing them from Asia. Companies and markets adjust to economic forces as increasing and decreasing competition raises and lowers the cost of doing business to constantly reallocate comparative advantage factors. Consider the cost of ethanol in the USA. Supply and demand curves express how much ethanol is demanded by consumers and how much is supplied by producers. Intersection identifies the equilibrium price paid in the marketplace, in this case, $2 per gallon for 6 billion gallons. This situation would happen if the U.S. were an autarky. The blue shaded area shows a condition of consumer welfare, as the area on the curve above the equilibrium price and below the demand curve. There are consumers willing to pay a higher price than equilibrium at $2 per gallon, but market forces support this price, so there are consumers enjoying a level of surplus. Producers with costs below the equilibrium price enjoy producer surplus by selling at equilibrium for the area below the $2 price and above the supply curve. But the U.S. is not an autarky. Free trade means trade between countries without government restrictions. Free trade helps consumers, but hurts firms that are less efficient than foreign competitors. As a result, these firms and their workers are often supporters of government policies that restrict free trade. These policies include tariffs, quotas, or voluntary export restraints. Seeking global prices brought into U.S. markets, we find a price of $1 per gallon and that U.S. demand for ethanol would not affect world prices. Following the horizontal line of world prices applied in the U.S., we see how U.S. demand would climb to point G, where consumers purchase 9 billion gallons of the product, up from 6 billion gallons. Of this 9 billion gallon use, only 3 billion would be provided by U.S. domestic producers. The balance of 6 billion gallons would come from offshore suppliers. Changes in consumer surplus would express how the overall welfare of consumers changed because of these economic conditions. We express this on the graph as areas A, B, C, and D. Consumer surplus increased because of these conditions, while producer surplus reduced to area E on the chart. Overall, economic surplus increased because of the addition of areas C and D. Tariffs are taxes governments impose on goods imported into a country. Like any other tax, a tariff increases the cost of selling a good. After a government imposes a tariff, there is a reduction in consumer surplus. The government collects revenues equal to the tariff multiplied by the quantity of the imported good. Some of the loss of consumer surplus is a deadweight loss. So there is a loss of economic efficiency. A quota is a numerical limit a government imposes on the quantity of a good that can be imported into the country. A quota has an effect similar to a tariff. For many years, Congress has imposed a quota on sugar imports to protect U.S. sugar producers. More on this one in a minute. A voluntary export restraint, or VER, is an agreement negotiated between two countries that places a numerical limit on the quantity of a good that can be imported by one country from the other country. The main purpose of most tariffs and quotas is to reduce foreign competition that domestic firms face. To continue our ethanol example, if the U.S. government imposes a 50-cent per gallon tariff, the domestic price would climb to $1.50 per gallon. Look for the new intersections of this horizontal line with the supply and demand curves to identify how demand is reduced to 7.5 billion gallons total, with 4.5 billion gallons supplied by domestic producers. Producer surplus raises by area A at the cost of consumers, who also lose areas C, T, and D. The U.S. government gains tariff revenues for the area T. It is money collected as taxes paid by U.S. consumers, not by the foreign ethanol producers. Deadweight loss is the loss of economic activities caused by tariffs because of transactions that do not happen. Tariffs reduce economic efficiency. A quota increases the domestic price of the good for which the quota is imposed, resulting in an increase in producer surplus and a loss of consumer surplus. A license from the U.S. government is required to import goods under a quota system. The licenses are distributed to foreign producers. As with tariffs, there is a loss of economic efficiency. The world price of sugar is significantly lower than the U.S. cost of production. In order to support sugar producers and our nation's ability to supply domestic needs, a quota was placed on how much sugar can be imported into this country. The domestic price of 43 cents per pound is undercut by the world price of 27 cents per pound. Because of the import quota, the U.S. price of 43 cents is upheld, while foreign imports to the U.S. are limited to 5.8 billion pounds. Consumers pay $3.9 billion to support domestic sugar producers, while foreign producers gain less than $1 billion, and a slightly larger amount is lost to the economic activity that does not happen, the deadweight loss. Partly as a result of the sugar quota, total employment of U.S. food and beverage firms that use sugar as an input declined by more than 100,000 from 1997 to 2011. a benefit to one sector of the economy may harm another sector. In the case of U.S. sugar beet producers, the tariff paid for by U.S. consumers, costing $3.9 billion, benefited about 3,000 domestic jobs, for a cost of $1.3 million per job per year. The cost of the quota borne by U.S. consumers. Although jobs are saved in industries subject to tariffs and quotas, the jobs are saved at a high cost to consumers. Many countries use tariffs and quotas to try to protect domestic jobs. In Japan, it is estimated that the government's restrictions on imports of rice cost $51 million for each job saved in Japan. When one industry receives tariff or quota protection, jobs will be lost in other domestic industries that must pay higher prices for the goods that receive protection. Often, economic tools of protectionism are applied with narrow view for overall effects. The industry to protect may be one of several affected sectors. How can this happen in the real world? Simply put, well-organized industries can lobby for government protection in the form of tariffs and quotas, while consumers, a traditionally poorly organized group, passively observe what happens, often wondering, what happened? It is easier to gain political support for reducing or eliminating a tariff or quota if it is done as part of an agreement with other countries that involves eliminating some of their tariffs or quotas. But the U.S. economy would experience a gain in economic surplus from the elimination of tariffs and quotas even if other countries did not reduce their tariffs and quotas. Consider for yourself, would the increased consumer surplus justify the removal of U.S. trade barriers? Governments sometimes erect other barriers to trade, including health and safety requirements. Many governments also restrict imports of certain products on national security grounds. Reasons for taxes and excuses for certain actions can be extended into many realms, but it is up to the people running the country and adjudicating responsibilities to balance national security concerns with consumer welfare. Debates over the merits of free trade and policies to restrict trade date back to the beginning of the United States. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which raised tariff rates to more than 50%. After World War II, government officials from the United States and Europe established the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, to reduce tariffs and revive international trade. Countries that joined GATT agreed not to impose new tariffs or import quotas. GATT was replaced by the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995. WTO is an international organization that oversees international trade agreements. After World War II, many low-income countries erected trade barriers. When the barriers prevented economic growth, many of these countries decided in the 1980s to become more open to foreign trade and investment and joined WTO. Globalization is the process of countries becoming more open to foreign trade and investment. Opposition to globalization increased in the 1990s. This opposition came from three main sources. First, some opponents were specifically against the globalization that began in the 1980s and became widespread in the 90s. Concern was given to free trade and foreign investment that might destroy distinctive cultures. Second, other opponents wanted to erect trade barriers to protect domestic firms from foreign competition. The traditional argument against free trade is known as protectionism. Protectionism is the use of trade barriers to shield domestic firms from foreign competition. Though protectionism causes losses to consumers and eliminates jobs in the domestic industries that use one of the protected products, it is usually justified on the basis of one of the following reasons: saving jobs, protecting high wages, protecting infant industries, or protecting national security. Third, some critics support globalization in principle, but believe the WTO favors high-income countries at the expense of low-income countries. The WTO strives to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. However, it is important to note that the WTO does not claim to be a free market organization. The system allows tariffs, and in limited circumstances, other forms of protectionism. WTO is a system of rules dedicated to open, fair, and undistorted competition. This compatibility to a certain degree of protection is proved, for example, by the fact that cartels like OPEC have never been involved in trade disputes with WTO, despite the evident contrast between their objectives. Dumping is selling a product for a price below its cost of production. Using tariffs to offset the effects of dumping is controversial because it is difficult to calculate the true production costs of a good. To a great extent, dumping determinations are considered a normative analysis tool, often based on subjective analyses. Many economists do not support interferences with trade, such as the sugar quota, but the opposite view is intellectually respectable. Measuring the effect of the sugar quota on the U.S. economy is an example of positive analysis. Asserting that the sugar quota is bad public policy is a normative analysis. It is possible for someone to understand the cost of tariffs and quotas, but still believe that they are good ideas, perhaps because free trade would cause disruption to the economy. The success that industries have in getting governments to erect trade barriers depends partly on some members of the public knowing the costs of the barriers but supporting them anyway. Two other factors are at work. First, the costs of tariffs and quotas are large in total, but relatively small per person. Second, the jobs lost to foreign competition are easy to identify, but the jobs created by foreign trade can be harder to define. Economics reaches into political science and cultural diversity issues. I recommend you approach these topics with your cultural blinders removed. This can be extremely difficult when looking at other cultures to avoid applying your personal perceptions to situations you may know little about. In this case of Pakistani children making soccer balls, the first reaction may be to conjure up ideas of child sweatshops and forced labor. Realities may reveal work with parents in a safe environment, replacing other less desirable conditions to fund a living for the family. Stitching soccer balls may be the lesser of all negative alternatives. Think about this comparative advantage video and the potential gains from international trade to organize in your mind how trade-offs are arranged for the welfare of people, companies, governments, and the world. Comparative advantage may result from producers who are better at some things or all things, but trade can make everyone better off. Take your understanding of tariffs beyond your personal understanding to spread with your fellow classmates, family, co-workers, and friends. Know who pays for these voluntary taxes and what the effects really are.